us for Science Gallery Bengaluru's exhibition season Psyche. For those of you who are new here, Science Gallery Bengaluru is a public institution for research-based engagement. Psyche is our 5th exhibition season and the 3rd that is completely online. Over the past 45 days, Psyche has been unraveling the complexities of the human mind. And today we are at a very interesting program, which will be unraveling an experiment that happened during Psyche. Before I tell you a bit more and introduce our speakers today, I'd like to tell you a bit about the programs coming up this weekend, this being the closing weekend of Psyche. Do join us tomorrow for a lecture by author Jerry Pinto called Reading the Mind. This is tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. in the evening. And also join us on Sunday morning for a very interesting workshop that reimagines social media platforms. This is conducted by our experimenter, Samyukta Prabhu. So that's on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. IST. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to Alistair Hopwood and Steven Frenda, who will be talking to us about the experiment they conducted at Psyche. Al Hopwood is an award-winning artist, writer, and curator. He has made moving image performance and exhibition projects with major international galleries, including Tate Britain, Hayward Gallery, ICA London, Wellcome Collection, the V&A, as well, and Mona. He has collaborated extensively with actors, filmmakers, writers, magicians, musicians, comedians, designers, cognitive psychologists, academics, and scientists. He was arts editor of the style magazine Sleaze Nation, and he's written extensively for Art Review. In 2013, he was the first visual artist to be awarded a Wellcome Trust Engagement Fellowship. And in 2019, he co-curated Smoke and Mirrors, The Psychology of Magic at Wellcome Collection. He's worked under a number of different guises over the years, including the fictional self-help company with TV and A.R. Hopwood. I'd also like to introduce Steven. Steven Frenda is a psychologist and professor at California State University, Los Angeles in the psychology department. He earned a PhD in psychological science from the University of California, Irvine in 2014, and then spent 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher at the New School for Social Research in New York City, and then joined the faculty of CSULA in 2016. His research focuses on suggestibility and memory distortion in legal contexts, autobiographical memory, and memories for public news events. His work has been published in high-impact scientific journals and has appeared in reports by major media outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and NPR. I'd like to remind the audience that there will be a Q&A session at the end of this event, so do keep your questions ready and add them in the Q&A box. The team will also share with you a link to our feedback form, so you can tell us your thoughts about today's session, the experiment, if you participated in it, and about the exhibition at large. Without any more time to waste, let me hand it over to Al and Steven to tell us a bit more about the fascinating results.
Thanks so much, Madhushree. Thank you for that. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. And then we can get going. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So yeah, first of all, just a huge thanks for all of you who've been able to join us this afternoon. And also a real thanks to Science Gallery for inviting us to do it today, and also for this really bold commission. It's been a hugely enjoyable process. And also I just would like to say a personal thanks to Steven as well for all his hard work on the project, and really looking forward to introducing his work to you all today. So yes, you've heard a little bit about what I've done in the past, but it's been an interesting couple of years. You know, I've been working for over 20 years as an artist, and I've written extensively and curated a few projects as well. But the pandemic has been a challenge. It's been a time of reflection for everyone, and in between bits of homeschooling and trying to work out what to do when all my projects were cancelled, I've been reflecting quite a lot on my work over the last few years, and trying to think about some of the themes that have linked together my very kind of disparate outputs over the years. And I think actually the main thing that I'm interested in is an ongoing fascination with the cathartic potential, and also the ethical limits of fiction. So when I refer to the cathartic potential of fiction in relation to my work, I mean when invented stories can console us or make us feel temporarily better about something by allowing us to externalize, work through, or just simply imagine something either positive, negative, fantastical, or everyday. And when I refer to what I call the ethical limits of fiction, I'm thinking about those tendencies that are rooted in our ability to imagine that can be exploited by others. What does it take for a fiction to be believed, and what happens to us psychologically when an undeclared fiction is presented to us as if it's actually true? Now, I've also come to realize over the last couple of years that one of my key aims in my projects is to encourage my viewer to critically reflect on their own stories, the believed fictions that we all tell ourselves every day in order to make sense of our experiences. When are they useful and when are they self-defeating? When do they bind and when do they create conflict? How can the act of thinking about our own thinking, or metacognition as neuroscientists would probably describe it, be purposeful and transformative in some way? And how can my work as an artist play a small role in triggering such a process? So with that in mind, and before I go on to talk more specifically about the collaboration that I've been doing with Steven throughout Psyche, I thought it'd be useful for those of you who don't know much about my work, just to give you a very brief snapshot of some of my previous projects that have explored the territory that I've just mapped out. Now, some of them are quite funny and playful and satirical, while others are rooted in historical and psychological research that explores the wider impact of the fictive on the self and also on wider society. So I'm just going to come out of my presentation for a moment and just go online, where I'm going to show you a few previous projects. So this is a project called With, which I've been working on for over the last 18 years. Now, as the fictional art collective With, I've created playful conceptual artworks for private individuals, museums and galleries through a series of satirical life enhancement solutions. Now, whether it be creating evidence of a happier or more traumatic past, possibly creating evidence of a life-changing spiritual experience, or designing your ideal partner, or maybe even exercising on your behalf, with claim to offer their clients time-saving solutions for personal growth and individual development. As you can see here on the website, there's a number of different solutions that the With Collective offer. There's 40 in total, so feel free to have a look through them. It's withyou.co.uk. And then in the case studies page, you can see a number of the different works that I've made with various museums and galleries over the years, right back to 2004. So a sister project of the With project is With TV, which is something I created at the end of last year, where I can be commissioned to fictionalize an experience from your past in film. Now, the first package available is called the Storyboard, where the commissioner's reimagined fictionalized experience is played out through a hand-drawn storyboard. Commissioners have included a former director of a major gallery, a musician, a psychologist, an art collector, and I'm also currently in discussions with a department from local government, so that could be quite interesting. To view the project, please visit withtv.co.uk. Now, shifting gear a little bit, in 2019, I curated with Honor Bedard a major exhibition at Wellcome Collection in London called Smoke and Mirrors, The Psychology of Magic. Now, the exhibition brought together objects from the history of magic, spiritualism, parapsychology and neuroscience to explore the psychology of belief, memory and perception. And here's a few images on my artist website of the exhibition. We had over 150 exhibits, and they included a ghost hunting kit, wax fingerprints created by a spirit during a seance, Tommy Cooper's fez, Derren Brown's gorilla head, Harry Houdini's bell box, a sawing and half box, and artifacts from a number of different psychology experiments from the Victorian era to the present day. The exhibition had 175,000 visitors and 19,000 people participated in the live program. And in general, the exhibition reflected on the ethics of deception and asked how we make sense of the weight of information that we're expected to process each day. It also explored how our beliefs and our fascination with magic and the paranormal can be easily exploited by those who understand how to perform a range of fairly straightforward tricks. So moving on to the next page here. Now, this is a project that I've been developing over the pandemic called Morph, or rather the Museum of Revelatory Fakes, with the brilliant sociologist and professor of global health, Patricia Kinguri, who's based at University of Oxford. Now, we're launching the museum digitally in June this year. This particular webpage, just on my artist website, just gives an overview. And we will be exploring through a series of case studies, historical and contemporary examples that reflect on the use, value and future of the fake in our so-called post-truth age. Now, each case study will feature a series of exhibits that include artworks, archival materials, and a podcast that explores the revelatory nature of each story. The first narrative will be about Alyssa Granato, a trial volunteer for the AZ COVID vaccine, who was a victim of fake news during the pandemic that claimed that she died shortly after her injection. We're, in fact, actually working with the very much alive Alyssa to understand the impact of being at the center of such a story and presenting a series of artifacts from her experiences in the museum. So this all leads us rather neatly on to this commission with Science Gallery. Now, since 2013, I've toured a project called the False Memory Archive internationally, based on fascinating scientific research that demonstrates how susceptible we are to false memories that I learnt about during a year-long residency in the psychology department at Goldsmiths College in London. The project features artworks, a book, a song cycle, an event series, and a unique collection of vivid personal accounts of things that never actually really happened. The project reflects on the way that we creatively reconstruct our version of the past, while providing insight into the often humorous and obscure and uncomfortable things that people have misremembered. Now, throughout the project, I collaborated regularly with psychologists and neuroscientists to revisit key experiments, reflecting on the history and consequences of this provocative field of memory research. Projects included a series of works made with Professor Elizabeth Loftus from the University of California in Irvine, whose landmark research has explored how memories of fictional experiences can be created through suggestion and coercion by an authority figure. I collaborated with Professor Chris French from Goldsmiths to establish my participatory archive where people could submit their own false or non-believed memories. And I developed new artworks in collaboration with Professor Giuliana Mazzoni from the University of Hull, Dr. James Ost from the University of Portsmouth, Dr. Kimberly Wade from the University of Warwick, and Professor Sergio Della Sala from the University of Edinburgh. So earlier this year, I was contacted by the Science Gallery to see if I'd like to present a work from the False Memory Archive as part of Psyche. And initially, we discussed the idea of presenting adapted versions of previous works from the projects. And then in what was possibly a slightly rash and impish moment, I decided to include a suggestion at the bottom of my proposal email that went something like this. Other thoughts at this stage include working with a psychologist to create doctored photos that we publish on the website and then ask the public to submit what they remember about the fake event. They wouldn't know it was fake at the start. It would replicate this brilliant study by Steven Frenda, a psychologist, called False Memories of Fabricated Political Events, but for an Indian public. Could be really fantastic. It would be an artwork and a scientific study. Then to my shock and astonishment, Madhushri and the team from the gallery came straight back saying that that would be something that they would really love to do. So then we set about trying to contact Stephen, who I'd met previously during a trip to see Beth Loftus in the US, to see if such an enterprise would be possible in such a short period of time. We had about 2 to 3 months. Stephen responded really positively, and here we are now today to talk to you about the study and to reveal some of its early findings. So I'm just going to pop back to my presentation here. So although my collection of false memories gathered during the archive project have been analysed by scientists in the University of Maastricht and published in a psychology journal, I've never actually been involved as an artist in the design of an actual false memory experiment. So this bold commission gave me that opportunity. Practically, it meant that Stephen and I crafted the experiment together. However, we were acutely aware of the need to work closely with the team at the gallery to get a steer on Indian news and politics. Now, for a number of years, I've been really drawn to Stephen's particular take on false memory research and his ability to link it with current affairs and our consumption of news. And before I hand over to Stephen, I'm just going to briefly outline our approach to this unique collaboration. So during our discussions about the project, we realized that doctoring a series of political images, as in some of Stephen's previous work, was going to be tricky given the short period of time that we had to put everything together. Stephen had also made it clear that from some of his past research that you could still get significant results without presenting faked images of the false event. In a past study, he simply presented, for example, archive or library images of the key protagonists alongside a very short description of the news event in question. This method felt much simpler, but was also relevant to the way that we receive information every day on news feeds. Often this technique is used to report real news. Time poor editors can dip into, say, Creative Commons images online and have a story ready to go in minutes without the need to pay a photographer. So after we decided on the method, we then had to turn towards the gallery for help in terms of the kind of events that would work and the kind of angle that we'd want to pursue. Stephen and I were acutely aware of our limited knowledge of the Indian political system. And we were given something of a crash course by the team at Science Gallery. And it soon became clear to us, which we found really interesting, that the left-right liberal conservative divide that is so clearly defined in the US and UK politics is perhaps slightly less so and not so obvious in India. We also agreed that we needed to have a different type of approach from previous studies that in the main have explored how people misremember negative false events. Instead, we wanted to see if similar effects would occur for false positive events. Would supporters of a particular politician, for example, be more likely to remember a positive false event than those who didn't support them? We're also really drawn to the connections between the entertainment industry and Indian politics. So we decided that we'd like the idea of most of our stories making reference to this link, or certainly to celebrity culture. It's intriguing how acting appears to be a brilliant skill for politicians to learn from across the political spectrum. It can lead to extraordinary empathy and compassion for others. For example, the act of imagining yourself in someone else's shoes is a skill that's not to be underestimated. However, on the flip side of this, the experience of acting can also give a firm grounding in what it takes to lie convincingly, perhaps, and to pretend to great effect. Although we're not suggesting at all that the individuals involved in our study are guilty of such an approach, we thought it was perhaps useful to consider what impact our love of fiction and celebrity can have on what we're willing to believe. So participants of the survey were given 10 stories in total, and they were asked to record what they remembered from each news event. They were also asked to indicate their voting preferences and how much sleep they'd had the night before. Buried in the news items were 2 false stories. At the end of the study, the participants were told that there were fake stories in the selection, and they were asked to guess which ones were not real. They were then told which stories were fake. The 2 fake stories were randomly selected from 3 that Stephen and I had created in consultation with the gallery, and they included the following. So 2013. During a nationally televised interview, Michelle Obama described Jairam Jayalalitha as an inspiring woman and leader who had dramatically improved the life chances of young women by investing in learning skills in Tamil Nadu. The second false story, 2015. I just got to move my box out of the way, just bear with me. I have to come out of this, hang on. In an interview with Vogue India, the popular US actor and activist Leonardo DiCaprio said he's interested in how Bollywood actors are so involved in Indian politics. He named Amitabh Bachchan as an inspiration and hinted at a possible run for US president in the future. And then in 2014, a letter from 1985 to N.T. Rama Rao from Bill Gates was published for the first time. The letter was one of many sent to prominent leaders around the world that explained the concept of the new Windows operating system. In the letter, Gates praised NTR's films and expressed interest in one day visiting India. So the study ran from the 1st of April to the 8th of May, and it was advertised by one of our partners on the project, the non-profit news website, The Wire, based in India, in a series of adverts that were carefully designed not to give away the fact that the study was in reality a false memory experiment. It had the desired effect. Over 800 people completed the survey, making it one of the largest false memory experiments recorded. Now, I'm going to be quiet now, and I'm going to hand you over to my collaborator on the project, Steven Frenda, who will talk to you today a little bit about his research, its origins and its wider importance, and also some of the early findings from our study. We'll then open the floor up to the audience for us to answer any questions about our collaboration. Thank you so much for listening, and Steven, over to you.
Thanks, Al.
Okay, I'm just going to...
Can we all see that? Great. Well, thanks. What a wonderful introduction to all of this. And I think I'll just start by giving you some background on research into memory that many others have done that forms the foundation for the work that we're focusing on. And maybe I can just start with a quick example to illustrate some concepts. So if you can imagine, this man here is taking a walk in his neighborhood when he sees this silver sedan roll through a stop sign, which would be against the law in the United States to not come to a complete stop at this sign here, but a law that's pretty commonly broken, I would say, at least in California. So not too memorable, but he notices it and he goes about the rest of his day until later he runs into some friends, and his friends live not too far away from him. And one of his friends says she saw a white car earlier that day driving erratically, and she watched it slam into another car. It was a pretty serious accident. Seemed like some people might have been injured. And our guy wonders whether the car she's describing is the same one he'd seen earlier. And later he has a conversation with a coworker who maybe misunderstands or mishears some parts of his story and asks, so that car you saw, how fast do you think it was going when it drove past that yield sign, which is another common traffic sign in the US? And the next day at work, our guy is thinking back over everything, and he has a lot of information floating through his mind, some aspects of what he originally saw. He's thinking about the story his friend told him, and even some information that came up in his conversation with his coworker. And as time passes, when he thinks back on what he originally saw, he has a lot to sift through. And what decades of research has told us is that because memory doesn't operate like a video recording, because it's a reconstructive process that draws on many sources of information, there's a real possibility here that his memory of the original event has been contaminated, and he might remember certain aspects of it incorrectly. It's even possible that he will become convinced that he did see that car that his friend described, the white sports car that was driving erratically. That must have been it. He remembers a white car speeding past a yield sign, probably on its way to cause that accident. He swears that's what he remembers, that's what he saw. And he's not lying. He's making a mistake that most of us are making more often than we probably realize. And that sequence of events is something that memory researchers have been studying in the lab for a very long time now. And there are hundreds, there might even be thousands of studies looking at something that follows this type of sequence. There's some event that a person or a participant in the lab witnesses, Sometime after the event, they're exposed to what we might call post-event information, which may be inaccurate or suggestive in some way. And then later their memory is impaired or altered. And that altered memory can be observed in some kind of testing phase that the researcher sets up. So many studies have tried to better understand this process. Oh no. Well, you'll have to give me just a moment here because my PowerPoint decided it was time to crash. If something like this doesn't happen, then you're not really living and having fun. All right. Okay. So I think what I was saying was that researchers have been interested in this process and in many studies have tried to understand what are the circumstances under which information that people encounter after they've seen something or had some experience will be incorporated into their memory and create an altered memory. So it's clear that people can misremember details from things they've seen and experienced, and later work would take this idea even further and explore whether entire events that never happened at all could be implanted in the minds of research participants. And in a now classic study done by Elizabeth Loftus in the 1990s, many participants were led to believe and remember that something that was completely made up, that as a young child, they got lost in a shopping mall, frightened and alone for a period of time until finally they were reunited with their parents. Many of those subjects were led to believe, and in some cases vividly remember, that this false, bogus event had happened to them. And this was done with the help of the participants' parents and the use of repeated suggestive interviewing. And at the time, it was a pretty dramatic discovery that memory was this malleable, that not only could you change details of something that somebody had experienced, but you could implant completely false events into the minds of research participants. Many studies since then have explored all the different ways that this might be possible. All of the different circumstances that could bring about what have been called rich false memories. In other words, memories that were detailed, often emotional, sometimes held with great confidence. And these studies looked at many forms of suggestion, including imagination exercises, dream interpretation, hypnosis, many, many more. Some studies even used digitally doctored photography to persuade the memories of research participants. So this is a really large area of research that I'm kind of glossing over here because we have limited time. It has explored many different areas of human memory and the malleability of memory in all kinds of contexts. And it also has a lot of applied significance that, you know, with more time would get a lot of attention in a talk like this. But in order to bring us to the topic that we're dealing with today and with this exhibition, I just want to talk a little bit about what has interested me for a while now, which is how people remember and misremember news and public events. What happens when people encounter so-called fake news? So many years ago now, this really unique opportunity came to us to look at pretty unusually large sample of people, and Slate.com, which is an online magazine in the United States that looks at news, politics, culture, and so forth, they published a really great piece on false memory research and on Beth Loftus's work in particular. And in the lead up to publishing that essay, they posted a survey to their readers and asked them what they remembered about a series of political events. And we had the opportunity to work with them to look at that data set and to learn more about this really interesting question. So we ended up putting together a publication that we submitted to the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. And we reported on these more than 5,000 visitors to Slate. And this survey that they took asked them whether they remembered 5 different political news events. 4 of those events really happened. 1 was fabricated. And that 1 was drawn randomly from a pool of several false events. I'll tell you about some of them, the ones that became maybe especially interesting to us as we were exploring those data. So here's an image of former US President Barack Obama greeting the former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, at a UN conference. And this event was actually created by doctoring 2 different images to make it appear that the 2 had met, when in fact, to the best of my knowledge, they've never appeared in public together in the same place at the same time. And here's another showing another of our former US presidents, George W. Bush, with Roger Clemens, who's a celebrity baseball player, spending time on his ranch, Bush's ranch, while New Orleans, a city in the US, was reeling from the devastation left by a natural disaster, Hurricane Katrina. And this too never happened, but the image was created by merging 2 unrelated photographs. So the participants were asked some questions about whether they knew about these events. And remember, they were hidden among true events. So for most people, they probably didn't stick out very much or seem that unusual. And what became very interesting to us was the pattern of results across different political identities. So I should say that in the US context, we really have 2 major viable political parties. And most Americans tend to align themselves either with the Republicans who are conservative or the Democrats who are more progressive. And because these events reflected kind of poorly on the politicians, so Bush, the conservative, was made to seem kind of uncaring in the middle of a national tragedy, and then Obama, the liberal, looked like he was being maybe too friendly with a hostile foreign leader that was quite unpopular in the United States at that time. The idea was that these events, they would appeal more to some people than to others. And we saw that reflected in the people who said they remembered the event. So for instance, liberals were much more likely than conservatives to say they remembered Bush's vacation, and it was conservatives more than the liberals who said that they remembered the Obama handshake. So since that time, this Slate demonstration was some of the first evidence that digitally doctored photographs of public figures might lead people to develop false memories and beliefs for these fake news events, although there's been other studies that have come out before and since that have looked at the suggestive effects of digitally doctored photographs, some really great work. And this was just unique in the sense that it was looking specifically at political events and was done with this kind of interesting, unusual sample from the public. And, through this interesting demonstration, we saw patterns that suggested that a person's political preferences could, to some extent, guide this process. So that, I think, leads nicely to the new work that Al introduced, which I'll tell you a little bit more about now. So a little more than 800 visitors to the Psyche exhibition participated. The sample was about 40 years old on average. It's actually a predominantly male sample. And I'm going to tell you just about the important key pieces of the method, which was that they were asked about how much they like a list of political parties, asked how much they liked a list of people that included politicians and actors, both in an Indian and US and UK context. And then they were asked about 10 news events. 8 of those events were real. 2 of them were fabricated. So 2 of the events were drawn from the 3 possible that Al told you about earlier. And for each event, they were asked a series of questions, but for the purposes of today, what you need to know is they were asked whether they were familiar with the event and whether they remembered specifically the time that they first learned about the event. We also gave them an opportunity to freely respond to explain more about the circumstances under which they first learned of the event and about some of their emotional responses and so forth. So Al already introduced you to the events, but you can see them again here. Here was Leonardo DiCaprio and Amitabh Bachchan, NTR and Bill Gates, and Jayalalitha and Michelle Obama. And you'll forgive me possibly butchering some of those pronunciations. I think I've maybe come a bit close, but probably not perfect. Okay, so first maybe what I could tell you is the proportion of participants for each of the events that indicated not only familiarity with the event, but also that they had some memory of the circumstances under which they first learned of the event. In other words, the event itself didn't just seem familiar, but they're claiming in their responses that they have a specific memory of learning about it. So for the Amitabh and Leonardo DiCaprio event, about 13% of the sample indicated some memory. For the NTR and Bill Gates event, only about 6.3% of the sample. And for the Jayalalitha and Michelle Obama event, it was 25.6% of the sample indicated that they remembered. Now, just like in the Slate study, what became kind of interesting as we looked more into the data were whether we could see some evidence that preferences or liking for these individuals might correspond to these rather positive portrayals. And in fact, what we found was that when we looked at people who indicated that they liked Amitabh Bachchan, which is represented here by the blue bar, and compared them to people that indicated they disliked him, that there was this slight difference. In other words, people who felt positively about him were slightly more likely to indicate that, yes, they in fact remember that event. We saw a similar pattern, but much more subtle here for the NTR event. And then when we looked at the Jayalalitha event, quite a dramatic difference here between the participants who indicated that they liked Jayalalitha and those that said they didn't. And in fact, when we looked a little bit more closely, analytically at these two differences were in fact statistically meaningful, whereas this one was not. I'll just speak briefly about maybe what's going on here, that this event in particular seemed a bit less sticky or less successful in a way. We tried to pair these people with, ultimately, we considered many different people from the US and the UK, but we decided on 3 people that happened to be Americans. And we chose them because we had seen some indication that perhaps they were very widely liked in India. And that turned out to be true. In the case of Leonardo DiCaprio and Michelle Obama, I think 5-6% of the sample indicated that they disliked those people. So they were widely admired, at least among this sample. Bill Gates, a little bit less so. About 25% of the sample said that they disliked Bill Gates. So it's possible that this event was just a little bit less positive, even for the people who really admire NTR. And also when you think about the content of the event itself, a letter from 1985 that has more recently surfaced, maybe the event itself is just a bit more obscure, or people as they read it decided it's unlikely that I've actually heard about that event. Whereas for whatever reason, we'll have to think more about this. The Bachchan and DiCaprio, Jayalalitha and Obama events seem to be more plausible, more believable, and more memorable for the participants. Another way that we can look at these data is to just look at, what percentage of the entire sample showed evidence of memory distortion for at least one event. And what we found was it was about a quarter of the sample who indicated not only familiarity, but some memory for learning of the event for at least one of these. And you remember that they were shown 2 at random. So some conclusions, some things to think about as we continue to explore these data. First, what a takeaway for me is that false memories happen everywhere, in many contexts. And it's a bit of a relief, I think, to learn that it's not just the silly Americans who are falling for this kind of thing, but it's really something maybe quite universal. The feeling that we're remembering is not always reliable. We rely on sort of this sense of familiarity, of that warm glow of remembering. And does that really always mean that it's something that we've seen and it's something accurate? And more evidence that we may be susceptible to suggestions that confirm our preferences. In this case, we have 3 events that, to the extent both people in the event are liked and admired, that these would be considered positive, would make people feel good if they liked the people depicted in the events. And that's something a bit new. Most of the research around false memories of political events has been about kind of negative distortions. And so this is just more indication, though, that even these positive events, to the extent that they confirm our hopes and our preferences, what we hope might be true, becomes more likely to become implanted in memory. And some future directions. Al mentioned sleep. We did collect data on how much, self-reported data on how much the participants had slept the night before. There's quite a bit now. There's quite a bit of research now that has looked at the role of sleep in the formation of false memories, and has found that people who are sleep deprived or even just underslept, less rested, are more vulnerable to the effects of suggestion. And we are seeing some evidence of that in these data. We are seeing a trend of a correlation where the people who reported less sleep are more likely than the more rested participants to show evidence of memory distortion. So we're going to continue to look at that and try to understand those patterns better. I think we still need to understand more about the possible consequences of these memory distortions. Could something like this influence voting intentions, for instance, or even lead someone to actually change, who they might vote for? I think that's something that is always going to be important to continue to explore. And then, unfortunately, I was reminded that at the end of that 2013 article on the Slate results that I wrote, that hopefully we can find some way to inoculate people against these effects, to help come up with some intervention maybe that could prevent fake news from altering people's memories. And I don't know, I'm a bit sad to say that it's still here on my list of future directions to learn more about what we might be able to do to address this issue. I mean, in our instance, these are fairly harmless distortions in the context of our study, but you can imagine how this can go quite wrong and have some pretty negative consequences to the extent that people change their voting behaviors on the basis of false information. So that was all I had to share, but I guess what would be the next? I'll turn it back over to Al or Madhushree.
Yes. Thank you so much, Steven and Al, for sharing both the thought process behind the experiment and the study, as well as some of your initial findings. It's quite fascinating to be able to hear that. And we already have some questions from our audience, but I'd just like to again remind all the audience members that you can share your questions in the Q&A box, and Steven and Al will be happy to take them. So why don't we get going with the first question? So one of the attendees has asked, what is the role of group identification, trust, and catharsis, as Alistair, you initially mentioned, but maybe needing definition, in these false event as memory experiments? And do these elements also involve a distinction between the research, Stephen, you cited on embedding personal memories as believed experiences and yours on belief in news events, which were not directly experienced? Do we want to maybe split them up? And
Yeah, I'm not sure how to address the idea of catharsis exactly, and I don't know exactly what we mean when we say that. I mean, when it comes to group identification, I think that was really what we were interested in the initial study, was trying to understand to the extent that people align themselves with one or the other team, because we have these two teams. I recognize that's less the case in maybe the UK and even less so in India. You know, it may seem very odd that we have just only these two viable parties and then people are in one camp or the other. But it makes it simpler in a way to study this in an American context, because people really are quite attached to their team. And I think even in recent decades, it's become even more acrimonious, and there's been more anger and dislike for the other side. And so, you know, we've been interested in how those feelings and identifications and that social identity really drives this process of what we believe and what we remember, and, you know, the kinds of information that we take in and take seriously. So, you know, we've seen evidence now in a couple studies, including some unpublished data sets, that, you know, people really are much more willing to consider and believe and remember information that is consistent with, you know, my side's good, your side's bad. So I think that's the role, that's part of what a group identification, that's the role of group identification. I don't know if Al, if you have some thoughts on this or on catharsis or some of the other parts of the question.
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah, I think, well, it's quite an interest. So there's a British comedian called Stuart Lee, who's great, and he's really quite political. He's quite outspoken, and he's often challenged about his work to say, well, look, you're not going to change anyone's mind. You're not going to transform anything. You're just preaching to the converted. And he kind of acknowledges that, and without, you know, hopefully avoiding the risk of misquoting him, he has talked about that it feels cathartic to be in a room of people who agree with you, essentially, and that you can have a good moan about the people you don't like. and the logic of that you can see clearly, and that they can't see, about why that other group of people is wrong. So I think that's quite an interesting and useful example. And I think there's something comforting about being able to feel like your worldview is shared amongst other people who you like and connect with and get on with. That feels like a very kind of natural instinct. And so I suppose that there's, whether or not, I mean, it's kind of comforting, it's cathartic in as much as, yeah, it perhaps makes you feel better about the world to understand that there are other people who share your beliefs or your fictions, however you want to describe them. So yes, I think that's a really interesting point. I think maybe there is something in our need for a group identity which can make these issues incredibly divisive if they are allowed to kind of spin out of control, I guess. But so yeah, I hope that's a kind of useful reflection. I mean, certainly in terms of the way that I think about catharsis in terms of my work, it's quite an old-fashioned idea, really, around the sort of telling of stories, making us sort of feel like there's a way to reflect on something which is, you know, causing you distress in some way, or feels like it's caused you harm in some way. To imagine an alternative scenario to that is cathartic. It's not, I don't think it's curative. I don't think it's going to change your life necessarily, but it can perhaps make you feel better for a moment. But that's very much related to art and storytelling, I think, and fiction. But yeah, thank you for the question. I hope that's goes some way to answering it.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Stephen, whether you wanted to add anything on the bit about the distinction between remembering false memories about personal events, like what you spoke about, like when people were convinced that they got lost in the mall, versus remembering events that are distant, like in this case, these political events, things that didn't happen to us personally, but we may have read of, heard of, so on. Whether what is sort of the distinction, and maybe the whether there's a difference in the way that we might believe these two kinds of memories, or remember these kind of memories.
Yeah, I mean, the work looking at what I called rich false memories, what, you know, that's a term that others have come up with, Beth Loftus and others. That was a real leap away from, you know, in a new direction, away from this idea that you can have some event and then people can encounter some suggestion or some misinformation that can change some detail. And sometimes that can be a very important error. You know, especially if somebody mistakenly identifies someone and it's the wrong person as someone who committed the crime, for instance, right? But then we got this new area of research which showed that you don't even need an initial event. You can have no event and simply start at the point of suggestion and create something that never happened at all. And I think that was a big, that was a door that opened for a lot of different ways of thinking about what might be possible with memory distortion. And that then went in all these different directions. And this is, I think, one of them, because this is an example of there was no event, you know, and now through some exposure to something suggestive and accurate, you know, that's something that's being created from whole cloth in the minds of the participants. So I think, you know, both are coming from this idea of memory that it doesn't operate like a recording device, that we don't record our experiences or things that we see or hear about or witness. You know, we don't record that. They're not in the brain, but that remembering itself is a dynamic process that draws on many sources of information and is reconstructive. And so I think the similarity is that both are indicative of the, you know, fundamentally how memory works, and no one is immune to this. You know, I mean, we have done studies on people who have very impressive memories. There are these people who have highly superior, what's called highly superior autobiographical memory. They can remember almost every day of their adult lives. You can tell them a date, April 12th, 1982, and they can tell you the weather on that day, news events on that day, what they were wearing, what they ate for lunch. It's incredible. I mean, these people have an unreal, evidently, an you know, endless capacity for storing information about every single day of their lives. And we brought those people into the lab and tried to implant false memories in their minds and succeeded. So if it worked on them, you know, really nobody is immune. So this is something that's really just fundamentally true of how our memories work. And so that I think both are coming from that place of understanding how memory operates, but there may be some differences, you know, in how we store information about our personal past and our autobiographical past versus things that are public, shared news events, you know, but I think that's a bigger topic, you know, that we could talk more about, but maybe are low.
And I think those links are only really being made, I think, over about the last 4 to 5 years since the impacts of kind of misinformation have been so much part of a public discussion, is that actually there is quite a dearth of research around actually how this stuff can impact people psychologically or change their decisions or whatever. And I think one has to be really careful that you know, it's not overstated, because there's not the evidence base really. But there is this, I felt as I was learning about false memory research on my first residency at Goldsmiths, it felt so relatable to a wider sociological and political sphere that I was quite shocked that it hadn't been related to that. I mean, you know, the Loftus's, you know, work around the corruptibility of eyewitness testimony was called the Misinformation Effect. So that sort of terminology has been used in this research for over 40 years, possibly longer. And so it does seem to me like it's an area for potential real insight into how certain beliefs could be reinforced or shifted in some way. And of course, you know, the 25% figure is quite interesting that the study came up with that. I'm sure Stephen has some thoughts on this, but it tends to be around, on average, around a third or quarter of participants seem to be quite susceptible to recording false memories within these kinds of settings, which are, of course, by their very nature, quite artificial settings. Maybe there's a higher instance out in the wild. It's kind of impossible to know really. But you know, if you think of 25 to 30% of several million people, then that's a significant minority. And so I think it really does, I hope, provide at some point it'll provide some insight into how false information can impact you psychologically. It's just then whether or not that has an impact on your behavior, I guess, is the next challenge, because we can speculate a lot about it, but it's important to have an evidence base around it.
Yeah, if I could just quickly add, you know, that 25% and that tendency for there, you know, to be a quarter to a third, yeah. I think it's important to remember that doesn't mean that a quarter to a third of people are vulnerable and the rest are not. What that means is that there are circumstances, and that's where I think the sleep findings become interesting, and also the preference-driven memories become interesting. It's more that at any given moment, there may be a quarter to a third of people who the right conditions are set that they become vulnerable, but all of us are vulnerable, you know, and it's hard to know why the 2/3 or the 3/4 resisted it in that moment, but those people are very likely walking around with distorted and false memories, you know, from other experiences they've had. So, you know, this is not about finding the suggestible people, and they're just always the ones that are suggestible. And
that kind of goes nicely into Mark's question, Madhushree, I think that's on there.
I can we can take that, I think, as our last question for today. So Mark's question is there also a key distinction between group bonding, catharsis, making our brain susceptible to trusting false news, conspiracy theories, and embedded memories as collective myths, and a more critical cathartic awareness of emotions in questioning while trusting news events and their sources, as in Brecht's alienation effect?
I mean, I think that points us quite nicely on from what we were just talking about, if I understand the question correctly. Is that actually this kind of idea of are there certain groups or certain types of people perhaps who are more susceptible to these processes than others? Mark, please do correct me if I'm not interpreting your question correctly there, but I get a sense that it's kind of driving at that. I mean, as Stephen's just said, I think there's risks in that we do just then say, oh, it happens to that group of people over there, and not us, because we're right. I think that there has been some evidence from some studies which look at questions around fantasy proneness, which is again a kind of is a psychology term which looks at people who are perhaps more likely to be quite imaginative, have flights of fancy, have perhaps more likelihood to believe in paranormal or anomalous experiences, or there being a supernatural explanation for that. But they can just also be creative people. You know, it's quite a broad definition, as often they are, and they're kind of inadequate. But there have been some suggestions in some of Chris French's research that perhaps they can sometimes be more susceptible to these kinds of susceptible to false information. But the studies are limited, and I think it's difficult to make assertions in that regard. But it still provided some insight. I think it's quite interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested to know from Stephen. I have a vague recollection that maybe in your original Slate study were Republicans slightly more prone to believe in the. I don't want to plant something that's completely incorrect. Because I don't want it to reveal any of my biases at all, but I vaguely remember that there was some kind of, it wasn't hugely significant, but there seemed to be a slightly higher proportion of Republicans who remembered Obama's handshake than Democrats remembering, or am I wrong?
Well, there was, depending on the event, certainly more conservatives than liberals remembering Obama's handshake, but then when it came to the other events, that trend was reversed. Overall, I don't know that there is clear evidence of conservatives being more suggestible or vulnerable, although that is something that we're trying to explore and understand. I know we're low on time, but I did see Anuj had their hand up. Can we go a few more minutes to take that question? Just
I mean, I'm happy to. If you guys are happy, we're happy to continue the conversation and answer more questions.
Yeah, there's also a follow-up question from Mark in the Q&A, so maybe we can take that first. And Anuj, if you can add your question into the Q&A box, please. Thank you. Mark's question is, but also that all people might be primed to be critical media viewers through education, and whether there are any experiments around that.
That goes back to the inoculation issue, doesn't it? Is what are the ways in which you can build awareness around some of these vulnerabilities? I think it's a great question. It's one that's very difficult to know at this particular point. I make art about these subjects, and I'm not so delusional to think that artworks are going to make a huge difference to the way that people perceive this kind of subject matter. I think, as I said at the start, I think what I would like to try and think is that it perhaps encourages, in response, a kind of self-reflective process, which is about trying to think about the way that you think about things, and what frames that activity. So thinking about kind of critical thinking, really, and what that means in terms of how we pick our way through the weight of information that we now appear to be receiving. I think it's also very dangerous to sort of think that these issues are new. They're not. They're really old. It's just we have slightly different modes of communication now, and perhaps the distances that that fictions can travel and be believed, and the sheer numbers of people that those fictions can reach is different from what it's been before. But perhaps the percentage of people who believe them is no different. Who knows? And as Stephen said, we can all fall victim to that. So I think if you were to try to design an ideal sort of education program around this, it would have to be rooted in how to sort of understand and notice your own beliefs and biases as you're approaching material, and then trying to understand the agenda of the people who are writing that material, without it resulting in some kind of reality apathy or some kind of sense that everything you read is fake or everything that you know is wrong. I think that's actually, I think a lot of the time these kinds of tactics, when they're played out within disinformation, or they're kind of weaponized, is actually around not necessarily trying to convince people that what you're reading is true. I feel it's much more about trying to sow confusion and trying to make people doubt that there's any foundation in reality to news reports or to things that are being presented as real. And that, I think, is possibly more malign than a simple belief in something that hasn't happened. Is stopping believing in everything. So yeah, I think there's real challenges in that, and hopefully people who are much smarter than me are starting to design them in some way. Stephen, I don't know whether you got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there has been some work looking at the effects of warnings as information is being presented. In other words, if you get a news report is shared on social media and it's flagged with careful, this might be this might not be credible, or this isn't this hasn't been verified by like mainstream news sources, something like that, then in some cases that can cause people to become a bit more discerning in the short term under some conditions. The problem is that much later, after time has passed, when you think back on that event, a lot of times we don't remember the context that we learned about the events, but we still remember the event itself. So, somebody who, well, I'll speak for myself. My crackpot uncle who believes in the most bizarre out there things shares something on social media, and I look at it and I go, you got to be kidding me. This is ridiculous. Of course I don't believe that. But then later, much later, I encounter it again and, oh, that's familiar. I don't remember that my uncle shared it or that I had this initial impression of it. I just know that it feels familiar. And will that then sometimes creep in? We're doing work on that too, where people are presented with suggestion more than once. They're asked about something and then we bring them back later and we ask them about it again. And we find that can really compound these effects. So I'm glad to know that there's some work suggesting that warnings could have some effect, but whether they really are like the answer to this and whether they have effects long-term, I'm less confident about that, but I think we still have to keep exploring.
There's quite, just to add to that briefly, there's a very interesting researcher, a guy called Stephen Lewandowski, who's worked in this area quite a lot, and he's written a thing with lots of other researchers, across international researchers, a thing called the Debunking Handbook or the Debunker's Handbook, which I've just put a link in the chat to. And he uses an approach which references various psychology experiments that have had to use deception in their methodology in order to understand the impacts of things like misinformation, fake news, and that kind of thing. And he has, it's a kind of user's guide for trying to argue back, I guess, or try to persuade when you see something that you think is clearly untrue. So it's debunking is a tricky one. The jury's out on its efficacy, but if that is the route that you want to go, then this is the kind of most up-to-date, scientifically sort of rigorous approach to argumentation that I think you could probably find at the moment. But it has limitations. It has limitations. So, but yeah, do have a look at that. So that could be worth looking at. And
that's a great point, because we actually worked with Steven during our.
Oh, did you? Great.
Yes, during our exhibition season Contagion. So on the transmission of fake news. So
yeah, he's brilliant. He's so interesting and well worth looking at his work.
Yeah, I'm sure the team can share the link to the recording of Steven's session with us as well. And given that we're a bit over time, I'm just going to, there is one question, but I'd say that maybe we can make this our last thoughts and wrap up with this question. So it's of course a more broad question and not necessarily specific to fake memories, but fake news has much more reach than others. So is it always needed to have, what are your thoughts on whether having freedom of speech on social media platforms, irrespective of any kind of censorship?
Stephen, you can go first. Oh, so tough. What a tough question.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, that's coming up right now with all the news around the purchase of Twitter and, kind of what, everybody's talking about that. I guess I worry about the idea of someone policing what's legitimate and what's not, because and if they are their own biases creep into that policing, then, you know, we may be in trouble. I guess I'd rather err on the side of having more information and leave it to us to decide for ourselves, or to, you know, there's no good answer to this, because it's, you know, really, like, harms will come probably either which way. But I guess I personally err on the side of more information, and then we decide for ourselves what's the good information, what's the bad. Are we great at doing that? I'm not sure, but
yeah, I mean, yeah, I would sort of instinctively, that is how I feel about it as well. And I have real concerns about the way that this particular discussion has become so tribal as well, and so politicized. It's I think that's really problematic. There doesn't seem to be much coming from, yeah, it's just become difficult, right? You know, yeah, I think that, you know, but the reality is, if I'm being honest, is when certain people have been silenced, it's given me a little leap of joy, a little leap of private joy. But that's my biases, that's my set of belief systems, and whether or not, you know, whether or not that's the way that you should be making judgments about what's in public commons, I think I have real reservations about. I think the challenge has to be, as Stephen pointed towards, and as we've been talking about, is how do we become, how do we use these very new tools, and how do we spot the BS when it's there, and how are we aware of it on our own side as well as it being on the other side? Because there's plenty of people whose worldview in pretty much everything I would agree with, who can post some things that I just find are absolute nonsense. And so it's a really tricky question, and I change every day. I kind of hold lots of different views in regard to it, but I tend to be more on the kind of Chomsky side of things, which is around give people enough rope. And we as intelligent information consumers can make our own judgments about who is telling the truth and who isn't, or somewhere in between. But it's so complex and difficult, and I think we still need to have laws against hate speech, but we do have those existing laws, and I think that how you do that across international platforms is the key. And I think it's really important that we continue to guard against hate speech and have a very clear understanding of what that is, and how it manifests. So yeah, it's a tough one. Stephen, any more thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, there's this cliche of freedom of speech, except you can't yell fire in a crowded building, right? So there's instances where speech may be not necessarily expressive freedom, but just harmful or creating chaos. And certainly, like around COVID, there might be certain kinds of speech or distributing of information that could be really harmful to the public, or Al mentioned hate speech, and sometimes one person's speech can harm another person's freedom of speech, and so these are really difficult questions, but all those things have to be taken into consideration, I think. Yeah.
And thank you so much, Alistair and Stephen, for sharing your thoughts on this, and of course sharing with us the results of the experiment. We look forward to hearing more details as you analyze this and any other interesting findings you might make. I'd also like to remind the audience that the recording of this event, as well as the rest of our events, is available on our YouTube channel. So in case you've forgotten something, you can always go back and watch it again. And if you like this event, you could also watch the recording of our film discussion between filmmaker Emily Seri and researcher Elaf Badar Edin on Damascus Dreams, Seri's film which explores memory, migration, and narratives of Syrian refugees. I'd also again like to remind the audience to share their thoughts in the feedback form. Tell us what you thought about today's session, if you participated in the experiment, and do see the exhibition before it closes this weekend. Again, thank you so much, Steven and Al, for joining us this evening for today's event, and we look forward to working with you again in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming. Cheers.